How did the Roman provinces of Egypt and Africa change in the era of Justinian? How can we imagine life in this now Eastern Roman Empire with its capital in Constantinople, as opposed to the earlier centuries when the capital was at Rome? How was life in Alexandria or Carthage around the year 600 AD? How did the cities look during this last stage of late antiquity, before soon the Eastern Roman Empire would be faced with huge challenges and before it would lose vast territories? These are questions that have always fascinated me and which I will try to answer in this video. The Roman province of Egypt was part of the Roman Empire for almost 700 years. From the Roman conquest in the last stages of the Republic, when Egypt became an official Roman province in 30 BC, to the loss of the province to the Muslim conquest in 641 AD, this huge time span is very hard to imagine, and the same is true for the Roman province of Africa. From the establishment of the province after the Third Punic War in 146 BC until the fall of Carthage in 698 AD, this province was part of the Roman Empire, apart from an almost 100-year interruption by the Vandals for an incredible 749 years, even longer than Egypt. But as we can imagine, the vast cultural transformation that had taken place in the Roman Empire from the early years of the empire until the 7th century would have a giant impact on how these cities would look, and naturally then of course also on the people that lived there themselves. So then how can we imagine life, for example, in Alexandria in the year 600 AD and in Carthage of the same year? These were the two largest cities of Egypt and Africa respectively in this now Eastern Roman Empire of Constantinople, which some also like to call Byzantine Empire. Now of course it is immediately clear how different the cities must have looked in places in 600 AD as compared to 140 or 30 BC. In such a vast time span, not only would architecture change dramatically, but so would customs, beliefs, and hence of course also everyday life. Luckily, many of the sites of Roman Egypt and Africa are astoundingly well preserved, and thus archaeological evidence from the 6th and 7th centuries is actually quite plentiful. Especially abandoned cities such as Duga are a treasure trove of information where we can understand how the cities themselves must have looked in the 6th and 7th centuries AD in the Eastern Roman Empire after the Western Roman Empire had fallen. The most obvious and visible difference must have been a far lesser density of ancient pagan structures and temples. Throughout the Roman Empire, at some places already in the 3rd century, but in others in the 5th century, a practice began wherein older structures that were beyond repair were taken apart for building material. This was called spolia, and it was practiced in the entire empire, but of course it was done so more in places where stone quarries were far away and where necessity dictated that such practices would be easier than quarrying new stones from far away, since that always required a working infrastructure and trade and prosperity, and after the 4th century AD this was less and less frequently the case. And so in Duga we can see, for instance, how the old pagan temple on the Capitolium was transformed into a fortress with huge walls built around it, which was done after the reconquest of the province of Africa by Belisarius. The building material came from older structures that were beyond repair, such as the circus or the amphitheater or other pagan temples nearby. So therefore, we would see far less ancient pagan temples in 600 AD than in 100 AD in Alexandria, Carthage, or any other city of Egypt or Africa. The cities became more functional, and old buildings that were not needed anymore, as they had been part of the old Roman traditions, were used to construct new buildings. Fortification walls were of course one such function that was very important, since no fortification walls were required during the peak of the Roman Empire, but they were very much required hundreds of years later, with constant threats from different external enemies. So the cities would have looked less pagan, if you will, and more functional, maybe also less artistic in some places. With the decline of the Western Roman Empire, so did the art form of statues also diminish. In fact, many of the last statues of antiquity date to the late 500s and early 600s AD. And this is no coincidence, since that ancient art form was intrinsically linked to the old pagan cults, and hence this tradition became much more rare with the decline of paganism. This can be verified, for instance, by the fact that the last pagan strongholds also were the places where the art of artisanship was continued and taught the most, such as in the city of Aphrodisias, which was a pagan stronghold where artisanship flourished as late as in the early 500s AD. There, many impressive statues were still created even that late, but that of course was the exception. In most other cities, with the triumph of Christianity, the pagan communities shrank, and hence also did this old form of art slowly vanish. It was supplanted though by very impressive mosaics. And so in 600 AD, you would see less statues adorning the cities as in the olden times, although of course there were still many, and they were carefully collected and preserved wherever possible, as evidence, for instance, from Ephesus shows. But it was just that almost no new ones were built after around 600 AD. Now interestingly, the makeup of the cities in Egypt and Africa, but also for instance in Anatolia and even Constantinople itself, would change in another very important way. But before we get to that, if you are a fan of the late Roman Empire like me, I can highly recommend an excellent book series by Gordon Doherty, which I personally liked a lot. This is not an advertisement, I don't receive any money from this, so this is really just a sincere observation, since I have been in contact with Gordon for a while, and so I've read some of his books. There really aren't many fiction books set in the late Roman Empire, so of course it's always beautiful to read one, especially if it's faithful to history. So I would highly recommend you to check out his series of books called Legionary, which take place in the Eastern Roman Empire of the late 300s AD, which is, as we fans of late Roman history know, a fascinating time. And you can even listen to all of his books on audiobooks.com. And if you are a Rome nerd like me, and chances are pretty high that you are if you are watching this video, then you might be interested in the incredible rings and other Roman accessories which the SPQR Shop is building. They make legionary rings, they make rings with different themes, they even make coin replicas, statues, pendants, attributes and terracottas. And the most incredible thing is that they handcraft every single piece. That's right, this is really high quality handcrafted material. There's really no better present for yourself or someone you know who might be a Rome fan. I put the link to their shop in the video description and into the pinned comment, and with this link you can get a 10% rebate on every purchase if you type in the rebate code Maiorianus. So go and check out their assortment, it's really quite incredible. So back to the cities of late antiquity. If you would have walked through Carthage or Alexandria in the year 600 AD, you would have been immediately struck by something else, apart from the abandonment of the old pagan structures and the reuse of building material. Namely that now, instead of the old fora, the main streets had largely taken over the function of meeting places of trade and commerce, of places of socialization and places of religious processions. This was visible in many places throughout the late Roman Empire. The most famous such example was of course the Mese in Constantinople, the giant triumphal procession street that had on each side colonnaded porticos as far as the eyes could see. Similar streets could be seen at Antioch, at Alexandria, at Carthage and even in Rome. Archaeological evidence as well as texts from those days show that the main street had now become the central meeting place and place of commerce. Shops would be set up now primarily in the porticos of these streets, between the columns on each side. For instance, a decree addressed by the Emperor Zeno to Adamantius, Praefectus Urbi of Constantinople, prescribes in meticulous detail how the shops along the colonnades of the Mese should be configured. The facades of their intercolumnar stalls were to be no more than 6 feet wide and 7 high. and to be revetted with marble on their exterior facings. Quote, that they may be an adornment for the city and a source of pleasure for passers-by, end quote. Similar trends could be observed all throughout the empire, and so the cities in Egypt and Africa would also undergo that change. The central street was now the main artery of the cities. Not only would we see shops there in porticos between the colonnades, but also decorations and statues that had previously been elsewhere would be moved there to adorn the space. Of course, religious processions would also take place along these central avenues. Whereas in the early empire, the forum was the central meeting place in which a local governor would reside and often adorned with a pagan temple devoted to the old imperial cult, now of course these central places of worship had been replaced by numerous churches that were scattered throughout the cities. Thus also the importance of the fora diminished, except of course the ones that were integrated directly into the main streets. The fora that were integrated into the main streets were kept in shape, repaired, and would see a continuous use well into the medieval times in many places, such as in Constantinople. Unfortunately, archaeological excavations in Alexandria and Carthage are only possible in very limited form, as these cities are now overbuilt and densely populated. So cities such as Duga or Ephesus in Anatolia serve as a blueprint in order to understand how cities probably looked during that time. For instance, excavations in Ephesus showed that the main street, the Embolos, was such a colonnaded street, and it indeed retained its significance well into the early 7th century. Only in 614 and 615 was the city largely damaged and depopulated in the disastrous Sasanian War, and hence this can be also applied to Egypt, which must have undergone a similar fate in that disastrous war. But until the early 600s, Alexandria and other cities in Egypt must still have retained a lot of their ancient splendor. And please consider supporting this channel via Patreon or YouTube membership, because I really need your help in order to be able to continue this work on late Roman history. Without your support, I don't know how much longer I can continue this channel, because as you can imagine, the YouTube algorithm does not exactly push a niche topic such as late Roman history. Alternatively, you can help this channel by buying my merch directly here on YouTube. I have created a merch store with some cool or funny or weird late Roman merch, which you can buy directly here via YouTube in the video description. Thank you very much. In Alexandria, the famous lighthouse was still standing unchanged since 850 years by that time, as were other ancient buildings. But most old pagan temples had been, of course, either converted into churches, or had been destroyed purposefully, or had fallen into disrepair and were thus used for the building of new churches or houses. Hence, we would here too see far less ancient pagan temples, although there would still be some. However, the density would be lower. But more churches, built with cupolas in the Byzantine style, would be visible. And of course, the old Roman bathhouses were still in use. These old bathhouses were in the early 600s still in use in many cities throughout the Eastern Roman Empire. Fascinatingly, since the early Roman times, a sign of an uninterrupted bathing culture that had lasted for 7 centuries. And they were still supplied by the old aqueducts, which had been meticulously repaired and kept in shape, as they were often the lifelines of the cities, especially in the sometimes dry desert climate, supplying them with fresh water from large distances, maintained and kept in shape for many centuries. In contrast, the old gladiatorial arenas had long been dismantled or used as storage spaces, as the gladiatorial games had been abolished in the 5th century. And so did most of the old hippodromes and circuses, as chariot races became less and less frequent. The same is true for Carthage and the cities of Africa. Even though the province had been occupied by the Vandals for 95 years, the Vandals did not tear down the old Roman buildings. In fact, they left them in place as they were, often unchanged. But of course here too, repairs were not so easily carried out anymore, and old buildings that were beyond repair were also reused for the building of other structures such as new houses or of course churches or fortifications. But apart from the buildings and the makeup of the cities, of course the population itself is of interest. Alexandria and Carthage remained very large cities, counting hundreds of thousands of inhabitants well into the Byzantine times. But of course these inhabitants were very different from the ones in Roman times. When you would walk through Alexandria, Carthage, or any other city of Egypt or Africa, you would immediately notice that the people were very differently dressed from the ones 600 years earlier. They would wear completely different outfits that had already begun to significantly change in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. Nowhere would you see an old toga anymore, as well as the lorica segmentata armor of the old legions, both of which are almost intrinsically interwoven with what we would see as Roman outfits. Instead, the people would be wearing tunics. The chlamys was also very popular, and of course the pileus pannonicus, which was still worn a lot even in 600 AD. But trade and commerce must have still very much resembled the commotion that we would have seen in the old days of the Roman Empire. There were many warehouses where goods were stored and loaded onto ships to be transported to other cities of the Byzantine Empire, which in those days still was very large and still encompassed much of the Mediterranean Sea. So trade and commerce was still very vital in the 6th century, and hence we would also see many grain ships leaving the ports at Alexandria, because they would bring grain to Constantinople the same way that Carthage had supplied Rome with grain for hundreds of years. Of course, in 600 AD, while Constantinople was impressively large and splendorous, Rome by that time had shrunken a lot, and it had not received grain ships from Carthage in at least a century. Thus, you would not see the same commotion of grain ships at the port of Carthage as you would have still seen in the early to mid 400s. But you would see many more priests, Christian ceremonies and Christian processions. Here, the main streets would of course be the center point of these processions, and many relics of martyrs were carried along the colonnaded streets of the large cities of Egypt and Africa until they would be put into their resting places in the large churches and basilicas of the now Christian Empire. So we see that even in 600 AD, Alexandria and Carthage would still retain much of their old Roman splendor, even though in somewhat diminished form. But these were still large and impressive cities. Other cities of Egypt and Africa were quite similar in their makeup, and in modified form you would still be able to see their Roman heritage, as for instance in the case of Duga, still an impressive Capitolium temple wood thrown over the city, very visible even from afar, showing its distinct Roman heritage. The old Roman structural makeup of the cities in 600 AD was still intact throughout Egypt and Africa, and in many places you would have thought that you are in the year 400 AD, so little had some cities changed in some places. So in those days, in the last stages of late antiquity, we would see the last times that the old Roman Empire would still be living on, albeit now not so much anymore in the old fora, theaters and amphitheaters and circuses and pagan temples, but more along the porticated streets and at the basilicas, churches and palaces of the state officials. But the baths were still very much frequented even then, giving testimony to the longevity of some Roman traditions, and we can be sure that some speeches or assemblies would even then still take place now and then in the old amphitheaters, many of which were still standing. Hence, in many cases, you would have found life in Egypt or Africa in 600 AD very different from life 600 years earlier, but in many other cases, very much the same. And please like and subscribe so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And please consider supporting my work on Patreon or via a YouTube membership, because the long-term sustainability of this channel really depends on your support. Because this channel would not work without our amazing Patreon and YouTube members, and I really want to thank each and everyone who is supporting this channel in any form. Gratias tibiago, amici. And if you want to learn more about the great cities of the late Roman Empire, you can watch this video here in the upper right corner. But if you want to learn more about how and why Rome declined so much after the 5th century AD, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago and benevalete.